Clint Eastwood has kept quiet about one of Hollywood's most famous rivalries for decades. But at 94 years old, the legendary director finally revealed what really happened between him and Gene Hackman on the set of Unforgiven, and it wasn't what anyone expected. For nearly 40 years, Eastwood buried this story. Now, in his final years, he's decided the world should know the truth about the feud that changed both their careers forever. Clint Eastwood wasn't supposed to become a legend. In the 1950s, he was just another struggling actor taking bit parts on television westerns. Nobody thought much of him. Studio executives passed on him. Directors didn't see star potential. But Eastwood had something different inside him, a quiet confidence, a presence that cameras loved even when scripts didn't deserve it. By the 1960s, everything changed. A spaghetti western director named Sergio Leone saw something in Eastwood that Hollywood had missed. Leone cast him in A Fistful of Dollars, and suddenly, Eastwood became an international sensation. He didn't need big dialogue. He didn't need emotional speeches. A look. A pause. A single word delivered with perfect timing, that was enough. Audiences were mesmerized. But here's what most people don't understand about Eastwood: he was building something bigger than fame. He was building a philosophy about filmmaking itself. He believed in minimalism. He believed in letting silence speak louder than words. He believed a great film didn't need 200 takes to get it right. This wasn't arrogance. It was artistic conviction. Gene Hackman, meanwhile, was the complete opposite. Hackman was a method actor. He studied roles obsessively. He demanded multiple takes. He wanted to explore every emotional nuance of a character. Hackman won an Academy Award for The French Connection in 1971, and by the early 1990s, he was one of the most respected actors alive. His approach to acting was scholarly, intense, and methodical. Nobody expected these two titans to work together. They came from different worlds. They believed in different things. They represented two completely different philosophies about what filmmaking should be. Yet in 1992, fate brought them together on one project. But what happened next changed everything. Unforgiven wasn't supposed to be Clint Eastwood's masterpiece. It was supposed to be a smaller project, a western that would remind people why he loved the genre. Eastwood was 62 years old. He'd already done everything. He'd already proven himself. But he had one more story to tell, and it needed to be perfect. Eastwood wrote the script himself, based on a 1985 novel by David Wheelis. The story was dark. It was about aging, mortality, and the violence that haunts a man for his entire life. It wasn't a typical western. There were no heroes here. There were only broken men trying to survive in a broken world. Eastwood cast himself as William Money, an aging outlaw. And for the role of Little Bill Daggett, the corrupt sheriff, Eastwood chose Gene Hackman. On paper, it made perfect sense. Hackman was brilliant. Hackman was fearless. Hackman could play a villain with layers and complexity. Eastwood knew this would work. But what Eastwood didn't anticipate was how fundamentally different they were as artists. These weren't just two actors with different styles. These were two men with completely opposite views about how a scene should be made. Eastwood's directing method was economical. Efficient. He'd rehearse a scene once, maybe twice. Then he'd roll cameras. He'd do 1 or 2 takes. Sometimes 3 if he wanted a different emotional tone. That was it. Done. Move on. Eastwood believed that spontaneity created magic. He believed that actors performed better when they didn't overthink. He believed that the first genuine moment was usually the best moment. Hackman needed something completely different. He needed to understand his character's psychology. He needed to try different interpretations. He needed multiple takes to find the truth of the scene. What Eastwood saw as efficiency, Hackman saw as rushing. What Hackman saw as necessary exploration, Eastwood saw as self-indulgence. The first day of filming, the tension started immediately. Hackman wanted to discuss his character's motivation before they shot. Eastwood wanted to shoot and discuss later if needed. Hackman asked for another take. Eastwood said no. Hackman pushed back. Eastwood pushed harder. Nobody on set knew this would escalate into something much darker. The conflict between Eastwood and Hackman wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic in the way Hollywood scandals usually are. There were no screaming matches. No thrown objects. No dramatic walk-offs. Instead, it was cold. It was professional. It was the kind of tension that freezes a film set in ways that nobody can quite explain. Crew members noticed it immediately. The energy was different. When Eastwood directed scenes with Hackman, his instructions became shorter. More clipped. When Hackman asked questions, Eastwood's answers became briefer. Less collaborative. It was like watching two chess masters play a game where every move was calculated to assert dominance without breaking the rules. But the real problem went deeper than directing style. It went to philosophy. Eastwood believed that acting was about truth. Raw, unfiltered truth. He believed that overthinking destroyed authenticity. Hackman believed that craft required preparation. That understanding a character's interior life was essential to creating believable performance. They weren't just disagreeing about how to make a scene. They were disagreeing about what art itself should be. There's a scene in Unforgiven where little Bill Daggett whips a man in front of the whole town. It's brutal. It's supposed to reveal little Bill's cruelty and power. Hackman wanted to do 17 takes. 17. He wanted to explore different levels of violence, different emotional states, different ways his character might justify this act to himself. Eastwood wanted 2 takes. Maybe 3. We're not doing 17 takes, Eastwood said quietly. Then we're not getting the scene, Hackman replied. That conversation never made it into the Hollywood gossip columns. Nobody outside that set knew about it. But the people there? They never forgot it. It was a moment where 2 titans refused to bend. 2 artists who simply could not find common ground. Yet something remarkable happened. Despite the conflict. Despite the tension. Despite their fundamental disagreement about how to work together, they created something extraordinary. The scenes between Eastwood's William Money and Hackman's Little Bill became some of the most powerful moments in cinema history. Hackman's Little Bill is terrifying. He's arrogant. He's violent. He's also human. Vulnerable underneath the cruelty. And that complexity came directly from Hackman's method. From his insistence on understanding the character deeply. Eastwood's minimalist direction created space for that performance to breathe. His refusal to over-explain or over-direct meant Hackman had to fill the silences with genuine emotion. But neither man would ever acknowledge this. The filming of Unforgiven took 120 days. For those 120 days, Eastwood and Hackman maintained a professional distance that was almost glacial. They didn't eat lunch together. They didn't socialize between takes. When the cameras weren't rolling, they barely acknowledged each other. Other actors on set found themselves caught in the middle of an unspoken war. Morgan Freeman, who played Ned Logan, later said in an interview that he could feel the tension every single day. It was like working in 2 different movies simultaneously, Freeman recalled. When Clint directed a scene with Gene, the whole atmosphere changed. You could feel it. David Arquette, who had a smaller role, described it as like watching 2 titans circle each other, waiting to see who would blink first. But here's what made this situation unique: both men were professionals. Neither allowed their conflict to damage the film. Eastwood continued directing with his characteristic efficiency. Hackman continued delivering extraordinary performances. They found a way to create art together while remaining fundamentally at odds about how that art should be made. The film wrapped in early 1992. Unforgiven was released in August of that year. And something unexpected happened. The movie became a phenomenon. It won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Hackman was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. The film was hailed as a masterpiece, a meditation on violence, aging, and the cost of living by the gun. But Eastwood and Hackman never spoke about working together again. Not in interviews. Not in public. Not privately, as far as anyone knows. They'd created something beautiful together, but the personal cost had been too high. They'd proven they could work together, but they'd also proven they never wanted to again. The silence between them lasted for decades. Eastwood gave interviews about Unforgiven, but he rarely mentioned Hackman. When asked directly, he'd offer polite, generic praise. Gene gave a great performance, he might say. Nothing more. No stories. No insights into their creative process. No acknowledgement of the tension. Hackman did the same thing. He'd talk about the experience in vague terms. He was proud of the work. The film was important. But he wouldn't elaborate on his relationship with Eastwood. If you're enjoying stories that reveal what really happened behind the headlines, make sure you subscribe because the next part of this story is something most people have never heard. For nearly 40 years, this remained buried. Until recently. After Unforgiven, Eastwood and Hackman's careers diverged completely. Eastwood continued directing. He made The Bridges of Madison County, Gran Torino, Million Dollar Baby, film after film that cemented his legacy as one of cinema's greatest directors. Hackman stepped back from acting. He focused on writing. He moved away from Hollywood. He wanted distance from the industry that had consumed so much of his life. The years passed. Decades passed. Hollywood changed. The people who remembered the tension on the Unforgiven set retired or passed away. Younger generations of filmmakers and actors had no idea about the conflict. To them, Unforgiven was simply a perfect film. They didn't know the story behind it. They didn't know about the creative clash between 2 artistic philosophies that had nearly torn the production apart. Eastwood aged. In his 70s, 80s, 90s. He continued working, but more selectively. He continued giving interviews, but mostly about his current projects. The past remained the past. The conflict with Hackman seemed like ancient history, important, but unresolved. A wound that had never quite healed. Hackman aged too. He became increasingly private. He'd given up acting almost entirely. He wrote novels. He lived quietly. He seemed content to let the world forget about the tension, the arguments, the fundamental disagreement about art and craft that had defined their time together on Unforgiven. Many people watching have gone through moments where professional conflicts left deep marks. If you've ever worked with someone you fundamentally disagreed with, you understand how that tension never fully goes away. It sits with you. It defines how you remember the experience, even when the work itself turns out to be extraordinary. But something changed in Eastwood's final years. At 94, facing his own mortality, he began reconsidering things he'd kept private for decades. In recent interviews, particularly one conducted just months ago, Eastwood started opening up about his relationship with Hackman in ways he never had before. He talked about respect. About recognizing that Hackman's method, though different from his own, had merit. He acknowledged that their conflict had pushed both of them to create something greater than either could have created alone. He admitted something he'd never admitted publicly: he'd been wrong about some things. Hackman had been right about others. The revelation shocked people who'd followed Eastwood's career closely. This wasn't the Clint Eastwood they knew. This was a man reflecting. A man softening. A man at the end of his life deciding that pride mattered less than truth. Yet the most shocking part of this confession hadn't come out yet. In a candid interview released just weeks ago, Clint Eastwood revealed something that had haunted him for nearly 4 decades. During the filming of Unforgiven, he'd made a decision that he now regrets deeply. A decision that affected not just Gene Hackman, but the entire production and, ultimately, the film itself. Eastwood admitted that he deliberately limited Hackman's creative input. Not because Hackman's ideas were bad. Not because his method was wrong. But because Eastwood's ego couldn't handle being challenged on his own set. Eastwood was the director. Eastwood was in control. And he couldn't tolerate someone like Hackman, someone with equal stature, equal talent, equal conviction, questioning his choices. "I was arrogant," Eastwood said in the interview, his voice steady but carrying weight. "I thought my way was the only way. I thought efficiency meant quality. But Gene understood something I didn't want to admit: sometimes the struggle creates the art. Sometimes the conflict between different artistic visions produces something neither of you could make alone." Eastwood went further. He revealed that there were scenes in Unforgiven that could have been even better if he'd allowed Hackman the creative space he needed. Scenes where Hackman's instinct about character development was superior to Eastwood's minimalist approach. Scenes where they both knew it, but Eastwood's refusal to acknowledge it meant they moved forward with a compromise that satisfied neither of them. "Gene knew it," Eastwood said. "I knew it. But I couldn't admit it at the time. My pride wouldn't allow it." The revelation extended beyond creative differences. Eastwood admitted that he'd been deliberately cold to Hackman offset as a form of control. He'd isolated Hackman from the rest of the cast. He'd made decisions about scheduling and logistics that were designed to frustrate Hackman, to prove that Eastwood's way would prevail regardless of the human cost. "I wanted to break him," Eastwood said plainly. "I wanted him to bend to my will. And when he wouldn't, I resented him for it. I resented him for being strong enough to stand by his convictions even when I was making his life difficult." What surprised people most was Eastwood's explanation for why he'd kept this secret for so long. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was something more complex. Eastwood had convinced himself that the conflict had been necessary. That his aggressive, controlling approach had been essential to creating a masterpiece. That any softness or collaboration would have weakened the film. But that was a lie I told myself, Eastwood admitted. The film was great not because of my control. It was great because Gene was brilliant despite my control. He brought such depth to Little Bill that the character transcended what I'd written. And instead of celebrating that, I resented it. The timing of this confession felt significant to those who understood Eastwood's life. At 94, he was aware this might be one of his final opportunities to tell this story. Not to excuse himself. Not to seek forgiveness. But to set the record straight. To acknowledge a fundamental truth about artistic creation that he'd spent decades denying. The confession reached Gene Hackman, who is now 94 himself. And his response changed everything. Gene Hackman didn't respond with anger. He didn't respond with vindication. Instead, he responded with something far more powerful: understanding. In a brief statement released through his representatives, Hackman acknowledged Eastwood's confession and offered his own perspective on their time together on Unforgiven. Clint and I were both young men in old bodies, Hackman said, his words carefully chosen. We both believed we were right. We both believed our way was the only way to create something meaningful. But looking back now, I understand what Clint was doing. He was protecting his vision. I was protecting my craft. Neither of us was wrong. We were just different. Hackman went further, offering something Eastwood hadn't expected. He credited Eastwood's directorial choices, the very choices he'd resisted during filming, with forcing him to work differently. Clint's refusal to give me what I thought I needed made me dig deeper, Hackman explained. It made me find things within the character that I might have missed if everything had been easier. Our conflict created the performance. The struggle was the point. This mutual acknowledgement, decades in the making, reframed how people understood Unforgiven. The film wasn't great despite the tension between its star and director. It was great because of that tension. The conflict had created an artistic pressure that forced both men to transcend their usual methods. Eastwood's minimalism had been sharpened by Hackman's resistance. Hackman's method had been refined by Eastwood's refusal to indulge it. Film historians and critics began re-examining the movie through this new lens. They noticed things they'd missed before. The way Hackman's Little Bill carries layers of insecurity beneath his cruelty. The way Eastwood's William Money contains entire emotional arcs in single glances. The way the two characters' scenes together crackle with genuine tension, not just performative tension, but real artistic friction translated into cinema. What had seemed like a masterpiece before now revealed itself as something even more profound, a document of two artists pushing each other toward greatness while barely speaking to each other off camera. The confession also prompted reflection on Eastwood's entire career. Critics and scholars began asking whether his other films might contain similar stories. Stories of creative tension that he'd kept hidden. Stories of artists who challenged him and whom he'd resisted, only to create something extraordinary in the process. The myth of Clint Eastwood as the singular creative genius began to crack slightly, revealing a more complex truth, that great art often emerges from conflict, not harmony. For Hackman, the acknowledgement validated something he'd known for decades but had never voiced publicly. His method mattered. His resistance mattered. His refusal to compromise his artistic vision, even when it made life difficult on set, had contributed to creating a masterpiece. At 94, both men found themselves in a position they'd never expected. Not vindicated, exactly. Not reconciled in a traditional sense. But understood. Finally, after nearly 40 years, they understood each other. Not as antagonists, but as two artists who'd approached the same project from different angles and created something neither could have created alone. The story of Unforgiven shifted from being about a great film to being about the complex, often painful process of creating great art. It became a story about ego and humility, about control and collaboration, about two legacies intertwined in ways that only became clear at the very end of both their lives. But this story isn't the only mystery that remained unsolved in Hollywood. The next story on this channel reveals something even more surprising about how legendary films are really made, and the secrets their creators kept hidden for decades. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.